if we look in $SQL plan statistics all, we can see that it's grabbed this information and stored it. If we run the SQL again, it's not going to use the information from the stats gather, it's going to use this information in SQL plan statistics all. So we run it again. The plan did not adapt this time. We can have a look from the notes that it used statistics feedback for the statement, not adapting the plan. And we can see what the plan really looked like. If we look in SQL, we can see the column is result adaptive plan for the first cursor, and then we can see the second one, is reoptimizable? No, it's got a good plan, it's happy with this. Is reoptimizable? Yes, we must hard parse and get a child cursor. Now, we also got a SQL plan directive when this happened. So when we go back again, the SQL plan directive will say, because this is 12.1 that's on by default, it will say, I'm using a SQL plan directive for this statement. And the one option the SQL plan directive has got is dynamic stats. So it's now using dynamic stats to get around the fact that when it gets dropped out of the shared pool, the statistics feedback for that statement will drop out of the shared pool too, and that's not persisted. So we run it again, we're going to get a dynamic query. If we look at the SQL plan directives, we can see that we've got dynamic sampling, SQL plan directive, single table cardinality misestimate. It's telling us that for one table, the cardinality is wrong. What should I do about it? Dynamic sampling. There are several reasons that will appear in here. It'll tell you if join cardinalities are wrong. If you've got column correlation cardinalities are wrong, it will create extended statistics to help you out with this. But I think that's quite interesting. Adaptive plans are fabulous. Adaptive statistics, less so. There's some other reasons the plans may have changed. Because I said if I do 7, I won't do 5. It might be 7. You might change an initialization parameter. You may be running with automatic memory management, AMM. Is anybody using AMM for their SGAs? Nobody? Excellent. Oracle have pretty much deprecated AMM now. If your server has more than 4 gigabytes of memory, it doesn't let you use AMM anymore. Well, you can go manually set it, but when you're creating the database DBCA, it will say your server has more than 4 gig, you can't use AMM. You might have modified some optimizer parameters. Or you might have dropped an index that you weren't using. The optimizer is really clever. It uses any statistics it can get its hands on. And if you've got a multi-column index, that's telling the optimizer things about how those columns relate to each other. And it will use that to optimize, even if it's not going to use the index. So if you drop an index, the safe thing to do is to add extended statistics to your table covering the columns that the index used to cover. It will make things a little more stable. Or you might have upgraded, or even just patched your database. But not with the PSU patches, because they do not change the optimizer. But any kind of other patching may. So what do you want to do about it? Since the cost-based optimizer appeared, plans have become a little more volatile. We don't want to go back to the rule-based optimizer, only Oracle still use that. Now, over the years, Oracle have introduced 4, technically a 5th option: stored outlines, SQL patches, SQL profiles, and SQL plan management incorporating SQL baselines. Now, stored outlines were introduced a long time ago in Oracle 8. And stored outlines try to convince the optimizer to use a specific path. And they do it through the use of many hints. they're actually rather effective. They don't guarantee a plan, but they do help a plan be fairly stable. The problem with them is once you put them in, they tend to stick there because there's no way to change them, and everyone is far too scared to take them out. And so you'll upgrade from version to version to version and copy your outlines from version to version to version to version to keep your plans stable. This is what an outline looks like. This is basically a whole bunch of hints to go against this SQL. And you've got to set a few parameters to get stored outlines to work. And the reason I've mentioned so much about stored outlines is that they're usable in Oracle Standard Edition. And all of the other things are not. Well, SQL patches are actually, these are also Oracle Standard Edition. And a SQL patch allows you to put a single hint against an SQL statement. And when I say a single hint, you're allowed 500 characters. So one hint can actually be quite a long string of hints. And you can use this SQL patch, and even this SQL diag internal, it's not a function that Oracle allow you to use. Realistically, you're not really supposed to use it. It's an internal function until we get to 12.2, when they've officialized it and given it a proper documented way of working. But pre-12.2 you can use this. I really don't recommend you use these, but the advantage of them is you don't need a SQL tuning license, and they do work on Standard Edition. On top of that, we've got SQL profiles. Now, SQL profiles are basically a bunch of hints. Sounds quite familiar. But they've got one extra wonderful hint in there, which is called opt-estimate. An opt-estimate is a hint that came along with profiles, which basically tries to adjust the join cardinality of your query to make it more accurate. Now, the problem with that is that's effectively statistics, but you don't regather your SQL profiles every few days. An opt-estimate is basically just a fudge, because as soon as your data changes, the opt-estimate needs to change because the cardinalities have changed. So SQL profiles tends to go stale, like statistics, and then they stop working, and then you need to regenerate them and get them working again. Usually takes a few months, and then suddenly things go wrong again. Something you told your manager you'd fixed suddenly is no longer fixed. You also need the SQL tuning license for SQL to use SQL profiles. And I don't particularly like them, but they do have some use cases now. Still, they can help be formed as a backup to things like SQL baselines. Now, from 11, SQL baselines came along, and the basic premise is that we try to restrict a SQL statement to the plans that we want it to use. And it does that via a series of hints, of course. But the nice thing about baselines is Oracle still looks at your optimization, and if a better plan with a lower cost comes along, it will capture it and store it, but it won't use it. And we have the ability to evolve the plans from the one we're using to the new plan in a tested way, and the optimizer will properly test and run the plans, and then it will say, actually, the new plan is a better plan. We should be using that one, and it will switch on the ability to use the new plan. But just before I demonstrate this, SQL Plan Management, when we get to Oracle 18, released in January, is going to be usable in Standard Edition. They've backported it. We won't need to use stored outlines, and we won't need to use SQL patching. It's going to be backported to the older releases of Standard Edition as well.